The tariff trap: how imported goods became America's secret tax on the poor. But here's what the history textbooks never tell you. The tariff wasn't designed to tax the poor. It was designed to save them. And the reason almost nobody knows this today is because the people who benefited most from that original logic spent the next 100 years convincing America of exactly the opposite. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you how an economic weapon meant to protect working Americans was methodically dismantled by the very people who claimed to champion them, and what that erasure cost ordinary people for generations. If you're watching this channel, you probably care about where power actually sits in America, the real decisions being made in rooms most of us will never see. So before we go further, I want to ask you, drop a comment below and tell me, when you buy something imported, do you even think about where that price comes from? Subscribe and turn on those notifications, because we're going to trace the answer back to some decisions that shaped your family's financial life in ways you've probably never realized. Wait, this part is important. The story everyone knows about the tariff is the story of greed, that rich industrialists wrapped themselves in patriotic language while secretly extracting wealth from working people. And yes, eventually that became true. But that's not where the tariff came from. The original logic was almost the opposite, and understanding that shift is the key to understanding why America's middle class rose and fell the way it did. Let me take you back to 1789. The American Revolution is over. The Constitution is barely 3 years old. And the new United States is staring at a catastrophic problem. We have no manufacturing capability. None. Every textile was imported from Britain. Every iron tool came from British foundries. Every piece of fine china, every machine part, every manufactured good that required skill and capital came from across the Atlantic, where British industries had a 70-year head start and industrial practices that were literally state secrets. Britain had laws against exporting its best machines. It had laws against emigrating skilled workers. It wanted to keep America dependent. The dependency was absolute. A young American mechanic couldn't compete with a British factory owner who had machinery imported from across the Atlantic. A farmer who wanted to buy an American plow couldn't. They didn't exist yet. There was no American textile industry to speak of because British goods flooded the market at prices no American startup could match. The system was engineered that way on purpose. Britain understood something fundamental. Whoever controls manufacturing controls commerce, and whoever controls commerce controls money. And they had no intention of letting America develop either. Enter Alexander Hamilton. Most people today remember Hamilton as the man on the $10 bill, or from the musical. But in 1791, Hamilton was George Washington's Treasury Secretary, and he was absolutely consumed by a single obsession: building American manufacturing. Not as a luxury, as an existential necessity. He wrote it all down in a document called the Report on Manufactures, and if you've never read it, you should. Because Hamilton explicitly argued that tariffs weren't about government greed, they were about breaking British dependency by protecting young American industries long enough for them to develop, to learn, to build capital, and to compete. This idea that you could temporarily tax foreign goods to protect nascent domestic industries wasn't radical. It wasn't even uniquely American. Every successful industrial nation in history has done some version of it. But America did it with intention. The tariff was explicitly designed to raise wages for American workers by making sure jobs existed on American soil. Because here's what everyone forgets. A tariff on British textiles didn't just protect British factories. It created room for American factories to be built. And when American factories were built, they needed workers. And when workers were in demand, their wages rose. By the 1820s and 1830s, the tariff was working exactly as intended. American textile mills were opening in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. They were hiring workers, mostly young women, many from rural farming families where opportunities were scarce. Those mills weren't luxurious. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the conditions would horrify a modern workplace inspector. But the wages were, for the time, genuinely transformative. A young woman working in a mill could earn real money, she could send it home to her family, she could save it, she could gain a kind of economic independence that agricultural labor never provided. This is the part of the tariff story that gets erased from the historical record. The tariff didn't exist to make rich industrialists richer. Well, not primarily. It existed because political leaders understood something that modern economists often miss. You cannot have a democratic, stable, prosperous nation if you have no domestic manufacturing. Because if you have no manufacturing, you have no working class with leverage, you have peasants, you have dependency, you have a permanent underclass with nowhere to go but agriculture or domestic service. And that is when everything changed. I will get to it in a moment. But first, I need you to understand what was actually at stake, because the moment this logic flipped is the moment ordinary American incomes stopped rising the way they had been. It's the moment we stopped being a nation that built things and started being a nation that bought things. And the people who engineered that shift, they had very specific reasons for wanting you to forget why the tariff existed in the first place. The original American tariff was born from a clear-eyed understanding. A nation without domestic production is a nation at the mercy of those who control production elsewhere. But by the 1870s and 1880s, something fundamental had shifted in how America's political and financial elite thought about that same tool. The tariff was no longer primarily about protecting workers. It had become primarily about protecting profit margins. And the person who understood this shift most clearly, who saw how to weaponize it, was a man named William McKinley. But understanding McKinley requires understanding the network of industrial barons, bankers, and political operatives who had spent the previous decades quietly reorganizing American capitalism itself. And that story, that is where the real trap emerges. That is where the tariff stopped being a shield for the working class and became a tool for their extraction. End of part 1. To understand what happened next, you need to understand a man named Mark Hanna. Hanna was not a politician. He was not an economist. He was not even particularly well known outside of Ohio. What Mark Hanna was, what he truly was an organizer, a networker, a man who understood that in post-Civil War America, the real power didn't come from winning elections. It came from controlling the men who won them. Hanna made his fortune in coal and iron, but his real genius was in seeing something that most of his contemporaries missed. The Republican Party, in the 1880s and 1890s, was fractured. It had factions, competing interests, and no unified vision beyond, "We are not Democrats." Hanna's insight was simple, but revolutionary. If you could consolidate the support of industrial capitalists, the railroad barons, the steel magnates, the oil refiners, the textile manufacturers, you could create a political machine that could elect anyone, control legislation, and reshape the American economy according to a single blueprint. By 1896, William McKinley was a congressman from Ohio with a reputation for one thing: understanding tariffs. He had authored what became known as the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which was one of the highest protective tariff rates in American history up to that point. But McKinley himself was not the driving force behind that legislation. He was the face of it. The actual architects were the industrial consortiums that had begun meeting in private boardrooms and exclusive clubs to coordinate their legislative priorities. What Hanna did was elegant. He took McKinley, a competent politician with tariff credentials and a clean public image, and positioned him as the Republican presidential candidate. But more importantly, Hanna then did something that had never been done before in American politics at that scale. He systematized the relationship between industrial money and political power. He created what was essentially a corporate funding apparatus that funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into a coordinated campaign. This was not technically illegal, but it was a fundamental shift in how American politics worked. For the first time, a national political campaign was being run like a business, with clear financial backers, clear returns on investment expected, and a clear understanding that the politicians being elected were accountable to those backers, not primarily to the voters. Hanna's network included men like Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate, Mark Hanna's own business partner in Ohio, railroad owners, textile manufacturers, and crucially, the banking establishment centered in New York. These were not theoretical supporters. They were expected donors. And with those donations came expectations. McKinley won in 1896. He was elected again in 1900, and during his presidency, the tariff regime that had been built in the 1880s and 1890s was not just maintained, it was elaborated, expanded, and defended with almost religious fervor. But here is where this becomes important to what happened to ordinary Americans. Wait, before we continue, I need you to think about this carefully for a moment. The tariff that was supposed to protect workers, that was the original argument, had become completely disconnected from worker welfare. McKinley's tariff regime was designed to protect industrial profits, not worker wages. In fact, the opposite was happening. As tariffs drove up the cost of imported goods, American consumers, including working-class consumers, were forced to pay higher prices. But wages were not rising at the same pace. The real income of American workers was being squeezed from both directions. They were paying more for goods because of tariffs. They were earning less in real wages because the tariffs that were supposed to protect their jobs were actually protecting corporate margins and shareholder dividends. The mechanism was elegant, actually. When tariffs protected American steel, for example, the American steel companies could charge higher prices domestically. That meant their profits were protected and could be reinvested or distributed to shareholders. But it also meant that any industry that used steel, railroads, construction, machinery manufacturers, had to pay those inflated prices. And they passed those costs down the chain. Consumers paid more for everything that contained imported materials or materials that had to compete with protected imports. The working class household felt the effect directly. Everything cost more. But the workers' wages did not increase proportionally. In fact, real wages in many industrial sectors stagnated or declined during the McKinley years, even as industrial profits soared. This is the crucial part that gets omitted from textbooks. The tariff did not fail to protect workers. It was never really designed to protect workers in the first place. That was the rhetorical cover. The actual design was always about protecting corporate profit. And McKinley, and more importantly, the network of industrialists and bankers around him, understood this perfectly. The tariff was a transfer mechanism. It transferred wealth from consumers, especially working-class consumers, to corporations and their shareholders. And the beauty of it, from the perspective of the men who designed it, was that it looked like it was about patriotism and protecting American jobs. Nobody had to admit that they were enriching themselves at the expense of working people. The tariff said it all in the language of national interest. By 1900, the network that Mark Hanna had helped construct was reaching the full height of its power. McKinley was president. The Republican Party was locked into place, and the tariff structure was generating enormous wealth for those who were positioned inside it. But there was a problem. The system was beginning to show cracks, and this is when the story becomes more interesting, because it brings in the third actor in this drama, not the workers, not the industrialists, but the farmers. American agriculture had always existed in a strange position in relation to the tariff. Farmers produced goods, wheat, corn, cotton, that were exported. They did not really benefit from tariff protection because they were selling into global markets where American tariffs could not protect them. But farmers were purchasing manufactured goods, tools, fertilizer, machinery, clothing, that were protected by tariffs. So farmers were paying high prices for their inputs while selling their outputs in competitive global markets. It was a raw deal, and by the 1890s the farmers knew it. The agrarian revolt, what historians call populism, was not primarily a political movement. It was a response to economic extraction. Farmers understood, correctly, that they were being squeezed by the tariff system, by railroad monopolies, by banks, and by the agricultural commodity markets that were increasingly controlled by large speculators and trading houses. The People's Party, which emerged in 1892, was essentially a revolt against the financial architecture that Hanna's network had been constructing. And for a moment, a brief, shining moment in American history, it looked like it might actually work. The Populist Party won significant support in the West and South. They elected governors, senators, and congressmen. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who had absorbed many of the populist critiques into his campaign as a Democratic candidate, came very close to defeating McKinley. But they did not quite win. And once McKinley consolidated power, the window closed. The populist movement was absorbed, defanged, or simply outlasted, and the tariff system remained intact. But the crack in the system was still growing, because the tariff, as it had developed under McKinley and the industrial network around him, was creating a profound imbalance in the American economy. Domestic prices were inflated, production costs for export-oriented industries were rising, and internationally, American goods were becoming less competitive because they were based on inflated domestic input costs. The tariff was beginning to work against the very industrialists who had engineered it. This contradiction, this internal inconsistency in the logic of the system, would eventually force a reckoning. And that reckoning came faster than anyone expected, driven by a figure who understood both the tariff's architecture and its contradictions better than almost anyone alive. His name was Woodrow Wilson. But before we get to Wilson, there is something crucial you need to understand about how the tariff trap actually closed around working people. Because by the early 1900s, something had shifted in the way that American politicians talked about the tariff. The language of protection was still there, but it was being paired with a different language, the language of industrial growth, of American competitiveness on the world stage, of building a global empire. And this is where the tariff stopped being merely an economic policy and became a tool for American imperial expansion. That shift changes everything. That is when the trap truly springs. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point in American self-conception. Before that war, the United States was, in many ways, still a continental nation, focused on its internal development and expansion. After 1898, America became an imperial power. It acquired territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, it was building a navy, projecting power across oceans, and beginning to see itself as a player in global affairs. And all of this required money. The tariff, in this new context, was not just about protecting domestic industry, it was about generating the revenue and economic surplus that would allow America to function as a global power. This is the part that almost nobody connects. The tariff that was ostensibly protecting American workers was actually financing American imperialism. The Philippines are the best example. When America acquired the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War, the islands represented something entirely new in American experience: a colonial possession with millions of inhabitants, complex local economies, and resources that American corporations wanted to access and exploit. The McKinley administration, supported by the network of industrialists and bankers around it, began thinking about how to integrate the Philippines into the American economic system. And the answer, of course, was the tariff. American goods were given preferential access to the Philippine market. Philippine goods were subject to American tariffs. And crucially, American capital could flow into the Philippines to extract resources and exploit labor at a level that would have been politically impossible in the continental United States. This is the secret architecture of American empire that the tariff made possible. The tariff protected American corporations from global competition at home. It also allowed those same corporations to access and exploit markets and resources abroad without facing reciprocal competition. American workers, paying higher prices due to tariffs at home, were simultaneously subsidizing the imperial ventures that would eventually reshape global capitalism in America's favor. But in the short term, in the early 1900s, the consequences for working people were straightforward. Prices were high, wages were stagnant, jobs in some sectors were disappearing as industries consolidated and mechanized, and the gap between the rhetoric of protection and the reality of extraction was becoming impossible to ignore. This is when something unexpected happened. A new movement emerged in American politics, not from the left exactly, but from within the business and political establishment itself. It was called progressivism, and its relationship to the tariff was complicated. Some progressives, particularly those influenced by the emerging academic field of political economy and economics, were beginning to argue that the tariff was not actually serving American interests anymore. It was serving narrow corporate interests. It was driving up prices for consumers. It was making American exports less competitive on global markets. And it was potentially destabilizing American democracy, because it had created a system where massive corporate wealth could directly purchase political outcomes. This critique was not in its origins a working-class critique. It came from within the educated elite, from economists, professors, reformist politicians, and even some business leaders who believed that the tariff system was unsustainable and needed to be reformed. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination, represented this complicated middle ground. Roosevelt was no radical. He was very much a creature of the Republican establishment. But he also believed in what he called the square deal, the idea that government should mediate between capital and labor, preventing excessive monopoly power, and ensuring that ordinary people were not being exploited. Roosevelt did not dismantle the tariff, but he did begin to challenge the most egregious manifestations of the system. He pursued antitrust cases against the largest corporations. He expanded the power of government regulatory agencies. And he gradually began to shift the Republican Party away from its uncritical defense of protectionism towards something slightly more nuanced. It was not a fundamental break with the McKinley system, but it was a crack in the facade, and it created an opening for more serious reform. That opening would be exploited by the figure who came next. Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, not because he was more radical than Roosevelt or McKinley, but because the Republican Party had fractured. Roosevelt, dissatisfied with his successor William Howard Taft, ran as a third-party candidate in 1912, splitting the Republican vote and allowing the Democrat Wilson to win with a minority of the popular vote. Wilson's campaign had emphasized the need for tariff reform, not elimination, but rational reform aimed at lowering prices for consumers while maintaining some protection for American industry. What Wilson did once in office would fundamentally reshape the relationship between tariffs and American economic life. And it would reveal, finally, the true mechanism of how the tariff trap worked. The Underwood Tariff of 1913 was not a radical document. It did not eliminate protection, but it did reduce average tariff rates significantly, from roughly 40% to roughly 27%. And crucially, it introduced something that had never existed in American tariff law before: income tax. This is the connection that nobody makes. The tariff reduction required a replacement revenue source, and that source was the income tax, which had been authorized by the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913. So the very act of tariff reform, which was ostensibly being done to help consumers by lowering prices, required the introduction of a permanent income tax on American workers and the middle class. The wealthy, of course, would pay the highest rates. But the income tax would eventually extend down to millions of ordinary Americans. The tariff trap had closed completely. Working people were told they were being freed from the burden of high tariffs, but they were simultaneously being locked into a new system of direct federal taxation on their labor. The trade was not particularly transparent, and it was not presented to the public in those terms. But that is exactly what happened. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The tariff trap was never really just about tariffs. It was about creating a system where the financing of government could be shifted from broad-based, visible, indirect taxes on consumption to direct taxes on individual income. The tariff had served its purpose as the initial revenue mechanism. It had enriched the industrial classes, it had financed American imperial expansion, and it had kept working people financially squeezed while appearing to protect them. But by 1913, even the industrial classes understood that the tariff had become economically inefficient. It was driving up input costs, it was making American goods less competitive internationally, and it was generating political backlash that threatened the entire system. So the solution was to replace the tariff with something more efficient, more direct, and ultimately more comprehensive: the income tax. The income tax could extract revenue directly from workers' paychecks before they even received the money. It could be scaled and adjusted with precision, and it could be justified on the grounds of fairness and progressivity, even as it fundamentally expanded the government's ability to monitor and control individual economic behavior. The irony, and it is a bitter irony, is that tariff reform was celebrated by progressives as a victory for the common person. Prices would come down, competition would increase, the stranglehold of monopolistic corporations would be loosened. Some of that was true. Prices did eventually moderate, and competition did increase in certain sectors, but what progressives did not fully grasp, and what the architects of the new system certainly understood, was that they were trading one extraction mechanism for another. The tariff had extracted wealth from consumers indirectly, through higher prices on goods. The income tax would extract wealth directly, from labor income itself, and the income tax, unlike the tariff, was infinite in its potential. There was no constitutional limit on how much of your income could be claimed. There was no apportionment requirement that would make it politically difficult to raise. It was simply a percentage of income, and that percentage could be adjusted upward whenever the government decided it needed more money. This transformation, from an economy primarily financed through tariffs to an economy financed through income tax, was not accidental. It was engineered. It required the coordination of political figures like Wilson, economists and policy advocates who understood the new revenue mechanisms, and the banking and corporate establishment that wanted a more efficient and controllable system. The tariff trap had served its purpose, and now the income tax trap was being constructed in its place. But here is the question that most people never ask themselves: who actually benefited from this shift? The textbooks will tell you it was about progressivity, about fairness, about taxing the wealthy more heavily to support public goods. And that narrative was certainly part of the political sales pitch, but the financial records tell a different story, one that reveals who really won when America switched from tariffs to income tax. Consider what an income tax actually does to a banking system. A tariff is paid once, at the border, on imported goods. It is a one-time transaction. An income tax, by contrast, creates a permanent, recurring flow of money from millions of individual workers and businesses directly into the federal government's hands. That money arrives in predictable waves: every paycheck, every quarterly filing, every annual return. For the first time in American history, the federal government had a reliable, controllable stream of revenue that could be forecast, managed, and leveraged. And who manages government finances? Who handles the flow of federal revenue? Who lends to the government when it runs short? Who coordinates with the Treasury on monetary policy? The Federal Reserve, an institution that had itself been created only 1 year before the income tax became law. In 1913, the same year Wilson signed the 16th Amendment into law, Congress also chartered the Federal Reserve System. This was not a coincidence. The Federal Reserve was designed to be a private banking cartel operating under the appearance of government authority. Its board of governors included representatives from the largest banks in America: J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller Interests, the National City Bank, and others. These were the same financial institutions that had been organizing American credit markets for decades. Now they were being handed official control over the nation's money supply, interest rates, and the relationship between the government and the banking system. And with the income tax providing a reliable, predictable, and ultimately expandable source of federal revenue, the Federal Reserve had something it had never had before: a government that could always borrow, could always service its debt, and whose ability to repay was backed by the taxable income of the entire working population. Before we continue, and this is crucial to understanding what comes next, you need to grasp this relationship clearly. The income tax was not primarily a tool for redistributing wealth downward. It was a tool for concentrating financial power upward. It created a permanent, direct pipeline between the paychecks of ordinary Americans and the federal government's coffers. That money could then be borrowed against by the Treasury, managed by the Federal Reserve, and leveraged by the banking establishment to finance massive infrastructure projects, industrial expansion, and military buildouts, all of which generated enormous profits for the financial interests that owned the institutions doing the lending. The tariff system had created incentives for American manufacturers to protect domestic production. Yes, it made goods more expensive for consumers, particularly poor consumers, but it also kept capital, investment, and profit-making centered within American borders. It prevented the wholesale flight of manufacturing to cheaper labor markets overseas. It preserved a certain degree of economic independence and self-sufficiency. The income tax system, by contrast, created a much more fluid and globally integrated financial arrangement. Once the government had a reliable income tax base to borrow against, it could finance the construction of global trade infrastructure, shipping ports, canal systems, railway networks spanning continents, that allowed capital to move freely across borders in search of the cheapest production costs. American corporations could now invest in factories in Latin America, in Asia, in any region where labor was cheap and regulations were weak, because they knew that the Federal Reserve would always be there to provide credit, and because they knew that American military power, now financed by income tax revenue, would be available to protect their interests abroad. In other words, the transition from tariffs to income tax was not simply a change in how the government raised revenue. It was a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between American capital and American labor, and between American power and global markets. It transformed the United States from a protectionist economy concerned primarily with domestic development and local industry into a truly imperial economic system capable of projecting financial and military force across the entire globe. And the working people of America, the very people the income tax was supposed to make contribute fairly according to their ability to pay, found themselves trapped. They could no longer protect their jobs through tariff walls. Their wages competed directly against labor in other countries. The cost of living rose as the protective tariff system was dismantled, but their wages did not rise proportionally. And every year, more and more of what they earned was deducted from their paychecks and sent to Washington. The tariff trap had been replaced by the income tax trap. Different mechanism, same outcome. Ordinary Americans bore a disproportionate burden of financing a system that primarily benefited financial and corporate elites. But now there was an additional layer of sophistication. Now there was an institutional apparatus, the Federal Reserve System, designed to manage the flow of that wealth and to ensure that ordinary Americans never quite had enough political power to overturn the arrangement, because the system itself was structured to be invisible, technical, beyond the understanding of most voters. The mechanics were opaque. The beneficiaries were hidden behind layers of corporate and banking structures. The justifications were wrapped in the language of progress and modernity and scientific economic management. But the reality was brutally simple. In the space of a few years, from roughly 1909 to 1920, the political and financial architects of America's ruling class had successfully engineered a permanent transfer of economic power away from small producers, local manufacturers, and ordinary working people, and toward the concentrated interests of international finance capital and large industrial corporations. This is the moment we need to stop and look directly at what we have uncovered. Everything we have traced, the tariffs that protected massive corporations while draining ordinary household budgets, the income tax that reversed a century of constitutional protection, the Federal Reserve itself, built as a private cartel disguised as a central bank. None of it was accident. None of it was inevitable. And none of it happened because it was good for the American people. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The tariff trap was not designed to raise government revenue. The income tax was not necessary to fund the federal government. The Federal Reserve was not created to stabilize the economy. Each of these mechanisms, and they were mechanisms, engineered systems, served a single coherent purpose: to concentrate wealth upward, to lock ordinary Americans into a permanent relationship of economic dependence on financial institutions they did not control and could not influence, and to insulate the decisions that governed that system from democratic accountability. Consider what happened between 1900 and 1920, just 2 decades. At the start of that period, tariff revenue was the primary funding mechanism of the federal government. This meant that the amount of money Washington had to spend was limited by what it could plausibly collect from import duties without destroying international trade entirely. It was a genuine constraint on government power. But the moment the income tax became permanent, that constraint vanished. Now, Washington could extract money directly from the wages and salaries of every working American. The only limit was political will. And who controlled the distribution of that will? Who sat in the rooms where the tax code was written? Not the working people whose paychecks were being divided. Not the small manufacturers competing against protected industrial giants. Not the farmers drowning in debt. The rooms where the tax code was written were filled with representatives of the same banking interests, the same railroad empires, the same industrial monopolies that had shaped the tariff system before it. The tariff system had created enormous fortunes for certain industrialists and railroad kings. Those men did not simply disappear when the income tax arrived. They evolved. They adapted their mechanisms of control. They went from controlling the tariff system to controlling the income tax system, and they did both while remaining almost completely invisible to the American public. Here is what makes this genuinely dangerous, and why understanding it matters today. The architects of American power in the early 20th century understood something fundamental about democracies. You cannot rule them permanently through force. You cannot simply decree what people will accept, but you can rule them through invisible mechanisms. You can create systems so complex, so technical, so wrapped in the language of scientific progress that ordinary people cannot penetrate them. You can distribute the benefits of the system in such a way that those receiving them become invested in its preservation and protection. And you can ensure that any attempt to challenge the system is met not with oppression, but with the argument that the challenger simply does not understand economics, does not grasp the sophistication of modern finance, does not have the education to comment on matters of monetary policy. This was the genius, if we can call it that, of the solution that was engineered between 1909 and 1920. The tariff system had been crude. It was visible. Everybody could see that certain groups were benefiting and certain groups were being harmed. Political movements rose up to challenge it. There was visible conflict. There were clearly named enemies. But the new system, the income tax and Federal Reserve System, was different. It was structured to be incomprehensible. The beneficiaries could claim they were merely managers, mere technicians implementing the best available economic science. The harms were distributed across millions of people in small increments, making it nearly impossible to mobilize collective action against them. And the system itself was designed to be self-perpetuating, with each element supporting and reinforcing the others. The tariffs protected the largest corporations from competition. That concentration of wealth allowed those same corporations to influence the design of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, in turn, controlled the money supply and credit availability, which determined whether small businesses could grow or whether they would remain dependent on the large established firms. The income tax ensured that ordinary working people could never accumulate enough capital to challenge the system because a significant portion of any wage increase would be immediately captured by the government. And it all happened so quickly, faster than the American public could organize a coherent response. Faster than the constitutional amendment process would normally allow, yet the 16th Amendment passed and was ratified in less than 5 years. Faster than any genuine democratic deliberation could occur. By the time most Americans understood what had happened, the architecture was already in place. The mechanisms were already operational. The beneficiaries were already entrenched. The question that should occupy you now is this: what remained unchanged? The tariff system, the income tax system, the Federal Reserve System, these transformed completely between 1900 and 1920. The people running those systems changed, the visible mechanisms changed, but the underlying reality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small class of financiers and industrialists, and their ability to shape government policy in their own interest, that never changed at all. What changed was that the system became harder to see, harder to name, harder to challenge. The visible enemies were replaced by technical processes. The crude mechanisms of the tariff were replaced by the sophisticated opacity of monetary policy. The conversation about who should control America's wealth and how that control should be distributed was replaced by a conversation about interest rates and reserve requirements and the scientific necessities of modern finance. And yet the outcome was identical. The same people who had profited from the tariff system under different names and different structures were profiting from the income tax and Federal Reserve System. The same concentration of wealth that had seemed so unjust and so visible in 1900 had become so naturalized, so invisible, so apparently inevitable by 1925 that it seemed like not a system of human design at all, but like the natural order of economic life itself. This is the real significance of understanding how the tariff trap worked and how it transformed into the income tax and Federal Reserve system. It is not just a historical curiosity about what happened 100 years ago. It is a template for understanding how power perpetuates itself in democracies that claim to be representative, yet are actually engineered to concentrate wealth and political influence in the hands of people who will never face direct democratic accountability for their decisions. The tariff system was crude, visible, and eventually became politically controversial enough to be challenged. Hundreds of thousands of Americans mobilized against it. They formed political parties, they demanded representation, they fought about what the tariff should be and who it should serve. Those were messy, visible democratic conflicts. But the moment the system transformed into the income tax and Federal Reserve framework, the visibility vanished. The conflict moved behind closed doors and into technical language. The people making the decisions could no longer be easily identified or directly challenged, and the beneficiaries of the system could claim, with apparent credibility, that they were not designing the system for their own benefit, but were merely implementing the requirements of sound economic science. This is where we stand now. We have inherited a system of taxation and monetary management that was designed not to serve the American people, but to concentrate wealth in the hands of those who controlled both the tariff system before 1920 and the income tax and Federal Reserve system after. The architecture has been refined many times over the past century. It has been made even more complex, even more technical, even more removed from democratic oversight. But its fundamental purpose has never changed. The real power in this system does not reside in the elected officials you vote for. They operate within constraints they did not design and often do not fully understand. The real power resides in the hands of the unelected technicians and bankers and corporate interests who design those constraints and who benefit from their preservation. Understanding this, truly understanding it, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a comprehension of how your own economic life has been shaped by decisions made in rooms you could never enter, by people you have never met and will never be able to hold accountable. Understanding this changes how you see the financial system forever. You now see the tariff trap not as a quaint historical debate about trade policy, but as the first act of a much larger drama in which ordinary Americans were progressively removed from any meaningful control over the monetary and fiscal systems that determine their economic destiny. You understand that the income tax and the Federal Reserve were not solutions to problems created by the tariff system. They were evolutions of the same underlying system of concentrated financial power, merely disguised in more technically sophisticated language. And here is what I want you to do with this understanding. Start noticing, when you read about economic policy or monetary management or fiscal debates, how much of the conversation centers on technical language and scientific necessity, and how little of it centers on whose interests are actually being served. Notice how often the beneficiaries of the system defend it by claiming that they are merely following economic laws, natural laws, laws as inevitable as gravity. And ask yourself, who decided what those laws were, and did you have any say in that decision? Because that is the real revelation we have uncovered in this journey from the tariff trap to the Federal Reserve. From the 19th century when Americans had no income tax, to the 20th century when they could not escape it. The question has never been whether the government should have power over money and taxation. Every government needs some such power. The question has always been, who decides how that power is used, and in whose interest is it exercised? For over a century, the answer to that question has been a small group of unelected bankers, railroad magnates, and industrial titans whose interests have been protected and advanced through a series of ingeniously designed systems that became progressively more invisible and more technically complex. The tariff trap was just the first of those systems, but understanding how it worked and how it transformed into something even more sophisticated gives you a map for understanding how power actually works in America. Thank you for following this story with me from the beginning. If you found this revealing, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next layer of how America's financial foundations were actually built. I read every comment, so if this sparked a question or a thought about how these hidden systems have shaped your own economic life, please share it below. I would genuinely like to hear what you are thinking about. Until next time, keep questioning the structures you have been taught to